Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Today the topic of our discussion is formalism. As in the last lecture also, we looked at how the new criticism and the developments in Russian formalism have helped pave the way for the development and progress of the subject of stylistics. Today we will look at detail what is Russian formalism, how did it emerge, and what are the basic features and elements that it introduced for the study of the poetic language or for the study of literary works. Looking at the conception and origin of the movement of formalism, we can trace what does it have to offer to stylistics, how stylistics as a modern method of literary understanding and criticism takes aid from the developments going on in the field of formalism. First of all, let us look at the origin of formalism. That we say that stylistic owes its existence to Russian formalism, that the development and movement that the linguists belonging to Russia they produced the texts in these fashions that they wanted to study the importance of poetic language. Their works in the form of prose writings were done for the sake of signifying the fact that the language of literature is different from the ordinary language, and the literariness and the functions of literary language add to its beauty as well as its functions, and therefore they must be studied in isolation from other considerations about the author's life or even circumstances of the age. Formalism is called Russian formalism as well because it developed in Russia by the linguists who studied the concept of the poetic language. It is a 20th century school of literary criticism. This school emerged as a different school than literary criticism because their starting point was that the literary criticism approaches text not as individual or independent pieces, but pieces associated with the author's personality and the time in which the author is living. The Russian school or the Russian formalism made its presence a distinct presence because they wanted to emphasize the fact that the text is independent entity, and therefore the language of the text is more profounder and deeper than what is assumed by the literary critics. So the group of linguists who want to emphasize the importance of language of literature, they produced a circle or a group of people who initiated Russian formalism. In the beginning, Russian formalism started with the two separate movements or groups. One is referred to as Society for the Study of Poetic Language, that was founded in 1916 at St. Petersburg, Russia. And this movement, the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, which was a devoted group of linguists, and they were studying the poetic language in order to examine and investigate the properties of the language employed in poetry. And this group of the linguists and critics was led by Victor Shklovsky. So in the school of the Russian formalism, the first group that helped the Russian formalism develop is referred to as the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, that was led by Victor Shklovsky. Side by side, another circle or group of critics and linguists was also working on the same idea of study of the poetic language for the sake of investigating its meaning and distinguishing how the poetic language is different from an ordinary language, and how styles and variations of style affect the readers, and what messages and ideas do the writers emphasize upon while they create a distinctive poetic language. This group was known as Moscow Linguistic Circle. It was founded in 1915. So the Russian formalism started in the earliest time of the beginning of the 20th century. It dominated the literary circles and the literary canon during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, from 20th century its beginning. These two schools, Society for the Study of Poetic Language, led by Viktor Shklovsky, and the Moscow Linguistic Circle, are given the credit of the beginning and the emergence of another school of thought, that is to study the literary writings, which earlier had only been the focus of the literary critics. So there are developments in the field of criticism of poetry, of literary language, as well as other genres of literature. So the gap that existed between the study of the language of work and the study of the themes of the work is bridged by the developments taking place in Russia, which began to be generally known as formalism, and specifically when they are referred to with reference to the place where they originated from, same movement is called Russian formalism. So Russian formalism is a movement forward for the study of the language of literature, because as we have discussed many times in our discussion, that earlier it was only literary criticism which was available for the understanding, interpretation, and discussion of the literary merit of the literary works. Now that the literary criticism has been considered to have more subjective approach, more personal approach, that a critic finds in a text something that is relevant to the time, place, history, biography of the writer. So it was felt by the developments going on in the field of linguistics that the theories of linguistics are applied by the linguists only on the language of communication, only on the spoken discourse. Then the attention that was shifted by such people like Viktor Shklovsky towards the study of the language of literature, trying to see what role does the language play in the writings or in the literary writings, is also to be studied and is of the same significance as would be the study of the spoken expression or the spoken discourse. Since we know that the formalists are influenced by the literary developments taking place or the developments taking place in the field of linguistics, linguistic theories like those of Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, they had a very great influence on the formalist school of criticism. Many formalists were influenced by the developments taking place in the field of linguistics, especially those which were the theories and concepts produced by Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Formalists produced as a united group or society, just the way we looked at it as Society for the Study of Poetic Language. They produce essays which attracted the attention of the linguists, literary critics, and writers as well. In those essays, the formalists sought to find out the formal properties of language of literature. And formalist essays on the importance of language reflected a predominant interest in linguistics. They wanted to approach literature from the linguist's orientation, from the perspective of a linguist who would look at language as discrete, individual and independent piece that is not to be given any subjective or personal meaning, or it cannot be connected with anything that is something that is hypothetical, which could be not justified by the evidence present within the text. Viktor Shklovsky remained interested and concerned with the literary theory rather than the linguistic notions, and he was concerned with the laws of economy in poetry and language. So there were also differences of approach of the certain linguists who were working in the circle of formalists. From among them, Viktor Shklovsky's concern was only on the poetic language rather than any other language, for example, the language of prose medium or the language of novels or fiction. So Viktor Shklovsky focused on the study of poetic language, and there he was concerned with the ideas of rhythm, rhyme, meter and its significance in the poetic language, as well as he was concerned with the idea of economy in poetry. Economy in poetry, that how poetry is brief, compact, what properties of language govern the fact that the poetry or the language of poetry is so vibrant and is so deep, yet it is precise and economical. It is not as expansive or as broad as the language and descriptions that are followed by the writers in the writings of prose and fiction. So Victor Shklovsky's concern was more with the literary theory that defines the poetic language. For example, he was working more in the tradition of the Aristotelian concept of style, as the approach seems to have taken its origin from the Aristotelian concept of the study of poetic language, that poetic language is distinguished from the language of prose and fiction, and it is also distinguished from the language of everyday discussion. So Shklovsky focused on the literary concepts of the poetic language rather than the linguistic concepts of poetic language. Whereas Jacobson, another important proponent of formalism, Jacobson's focus was on the linguistic features of the study of style of poetry. So within the formalist school, people or the experts have a mixed tendency. For instance, if Victor Shklovsky approaches literary writings from the perspective of a literary critic, where he wants to look at the stylistic devices and the poetic language, he does not want to approach it from a linguist stance. Rather, he's more concerned with the economy and the rules that govern the creation of poetry, more like the Aristotelian concept of study of poetic language. Whereas Jacobson, or Roman Jacobson, he was interested in the study of meter, rhyme, and the composition of the poetry. So one thing that the formalists agreed upon, and that was quite the same as their principal objective, was the study of poetic language. So initially, the formalist school of criticism, which stylistic takes as its origin, devoted its attention to the study of poetic language, because as we know that poetry provides more margin and more room for the writer to experiment with language, to make language seem novel, different, unusual, even artistic. Now that poetry has this much potential of experimentation with the language, and there is always a design behind the changes and the novelty that occurs in the poem, now it becomes the job of a critic to explore the nature of poetic language, the significance of poetic language, and the features and intricacies which poetic language contains within it, which make meaning seem strange, unusual, or ambiguous. So that is why one thing is common in the proponents of formalist school, like Victor Shklovsky and Roman Jacobson. They both are devoting their attention to the understanding and interpretation of the poetic language. So instead of studying prose and fiction, their focus is on the language of poetry. And if Shklovsky is taking the stance of a literary critic to understand the poetic style and laws of economy, Jacobson approaches it from the linguist orientation, pursuing Ferdinand de Saussure's theories of linguistics, that how language is a referent, how language is an idea, not something that it inherently contains within the word. So these notions which we study in linguistics are applied by the formalist proponents or the formalist critics to the study of poetry of language, which stylistic also takes into account, because stylistics also believes that a linguist's perspective would be the whole analysis only if it is amalgamated with the analysis of a literary critic. So if literary criticism had already been there to let us comment upon the significance and meaning and interpretation of the text, now the developments in the 20th century in the field of linguistics and the developments taken in the formalist school in their pursuit of the understanding of the linguistic theories of Ferdinand de Saussure, they follow the same notions for the study of the poetic language for the sake of understanding its meaning and significance in the poetic and literary works. Now, with the passage of time, the formalist school developed its emphasis on the synchronic nature of poetic devices rather than the diachronic nature of language. We can see that the synchronic nature of poetic devices was gradually mediated, and it was realized that literature should be considered with its diachronic contexts as well. Now, synchronic nature of language means that how language is observed to be functioning in a specific context or time, rather than its association with past or the traditions. We know that language functions in connection with what is happening around and what has happened earlier or in the past. So what has language to contain on the basis of what developments have occurred in the past is the diachronic nature of language, its connection with the developments taking place in the past. And the synchronic nature of language is that how in a given time, how in a particular limited context, language functions, words act and react upon the other words, and what meanings do they generate. So, initially, the formalists focused on the synchronic nature of language. That is, that language should be limited within the context in which it occurs or in which it is seen. And they did not consider it important that the language should have any connection with the past or what has happened earlier. So historical perspectives or the historical development that has to give or add something to writing or language was not considered important earlier. That is why earlier the synchronic or the limited context of the language study was the concern of the formalists. But later on, with the many streams, thoughts and attitudes developing within the formalist school, the proponents of formalism began to give importance also to the diachronic context as well, that how language has changed over the period of time. One reason is that language is in a constant state of development. Certain words we know have become archaic or obsolete. So that is why how language has changed, how it has improved, how it has been modified over the period of time under the course of the development of language, it is also to be studied. So the shift from synchronic to diachronic nature of language means that earlier the formalists looked at language in a limited context. For example, if we are observing the language of a poem, only what do the words mean within that context, within the poem, is of great concern for the linguist or the formalist critic. Whereas later on, they would also like to connect with the past. What meanings did the words used by the poet connote? Were the meanings the same in the past, or are the meanings the same in the society, in the context in which it used to exist? Or are the words to be taken in with the same meaning that the poem presents them to be? So we realize that the notion of the meaning of words changes in the context. Certain words may have a positive connotation, but in a particular context they may be used in a negative sense too. So this way of approaching language, its meaning and words, emphasizes the importance that the words and their study or the study of their meaning should not just be limited to the synchronic context, that is the limited or the specific context in which the words occur, but also the diachronic nature of the development of language, in which we look at how the words have changed or the meanings have enhanced due to its use and changes in the way people use it now. it is also to be given consideration. So this is one of the very major aspects of the formalist school that they developed for the study of language, and they made the critics realize the significance of the language use, that how words in a context and situation may change their meaning or may even lose their meaning, which in the past were associated with them. So when the focus of the formalists shifted to the study of the formal aspects or properties of language and the meanings and the uses of words, their focus also shifted on the fact that how words have come to be taken in particular meanings in which they exist now, how the meanings have been received in the past. So that change that occurs in the perception and understanding of language and words is also one of the concerns of the formalist school of literary criticism. In the beginning, formalists based their assumptions or their reading of the poetry on the theories developed by the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, and also on the developments going on in the 20th century as the symbolist movement. And these notions were concerned with the autonomy of the text and the discontinuity between literary and other uses of language. So they focused on the fact that literary use of language is distinct and unique. For example, the symbolists approach the literary symbols and the literary use of language in a way that enhances or multiplies the meaning of words. So if the ordinary language or the language of everyday use takes words in particular meanings, the language of literature or poetry will not stick to those meanings which are prevalent in the society, which are generally perceived by the layman in the society. So symbolist notion of the meaning of words, symbols, was concerned with the idea that text is autonomous and there is discontinuity and disconnection between literary use of language and ordinary use of language, because we realize that a symbol conveys those meanings which are not the part of the literal meaning of the word. For example, if symbols are used in literary text, for example, in the form of the image of a swan or the image of a dove, we look at these images as a layman as common representations of a certain species of birds. But for a literary understanding and for a symbolist point of view, they would connote, for example, serenity, peace, beauty, innocence. Now, these symbols signify that the use of literary language and the ordinary language or everyday language is to be distinguished, because there is discontinuity between its functions and its uses. So the ordinary language may not indulge into the symbolic connotations of the words and their understanding, whereas the literary language would look at the enhanced and the novel meanings that are associated with a particular symbol, which does not just refer to the denotative or the literal meaning of a symbol. Formalists also sought to make their critical understanding or analysis more objective and scientific rather than the symbolists, because symbolist criticism too would be taken from the perspective of a literary critic that would be personal and subjective. So though they took inspiration from the symbolists who emphasized the idea that language of literature is distinct and unique, now the formalists take this thing from the symbolists. That symbolist stance that literary language is not the same as that of the ordinary language, and there should be discontinuity in the meaning, messages and understanding of ordinary and the literary language. That is what these linguists in the formalist school owe to symbolism, because symbolism signified to them the importance of words that occur in poetry and literature in different meanings, which might occur in ordinary language in completely different or unusual ways. So this is what the formalists seek to capture or inherit from the symbolist movement, that is the idea of discrepancy, differences, and autonomy between the ordinary language and the language of literature. The emphasis and the major focus of formalists is on the medium. Now, when we say that the formalists give importance to the medium, that brings to focus the idea of importance of form. For example, what medium does a writer choose for literary expression? The medium is literature, poetry, or prose or fiction. Now that the formalist emphasis lies on the study of the medium or form, they want to study literary writing. They want to study literary language, especially the language of poetry, because poetry enables a writer to make use of more artistic devices and certain emotive devices to make the reality or to make the feeling or perception seem strange and unusual. So when the form of poetry offers more ambiguity, more strangeness, then there is a room for the linguist or the formalist or the literary critic to scrutinize the text, because the literary text is presenting something in an unfamiliar way. Now, this strangeness adds to the beauty of the poetry or the literary writing, and in the terms of formalists, this is known as defamiliarization, the concept of defamiliarization. We will look at this concept in detail in our today's discussion, but this is one of the major focuses of the formalist school, because formalists take this notion from symbolists, that the language of literature is symbolic, it is strange, unusual, it is packed with meaning, it is filled with so much depth, and one needs to analyze it more scientifically and more in detail, and we cannot overlook the significance of the symbols or objects that occur in literary writing or in poetry. Now, the formalist, in order to verify these assumptions, these rules and principles that they devise, took the poetry or the study of poetry as their task initially. They applied their theory, their practice, their understanding and criticism on the language of poetry. And they reached to this conclusion that the language of poetry defamiliarizes the reality, or it makes things strange and unusual. Now, it is very beautiful a concept that is associated with poetry, that a poet might be telling or retelling the same feelings and emotions which a number of other poets and writers might have gone through. But the art or the skill of the poet does not lie in the very fact of telling something that is known to the reader or that has been felt, experienced by other people too. His art and skill lies in the fact that how he presents something familiar to the reader as if he is receiving it for the first time, as if he had never known that feeling or emotion. So that is the beauty of a literary text. For example, observe for the understanding of this notion of defamiliarization, one of the poems of John Keats' ode on Nightingale. If you notice the poem's theme and its ideas, you feel that it is one of the major themes of the romantic poetry, repeated by many writers and poets in the romantic age as well as ages in the later or earlier times too, that he is seeking escape from the ephemeral and the transient life or the world through the voice, through the music or the melody of the bird nightingale's song. And through the instrument of the nightingale's song, he makes a journey into another realm that is everlasting and that is never ending, like heaven. Now, this escapism this flight of fancy is not something new, but the way the poet presents it is strange and unusual, because the title of the poem states Ode to a Nightingale, and a common reader who is familiar with the understanding of poetry and romantic poetry might have felt that here the poet might be paying a tribute to the beauty of the bird nightingale, or maybe he is paying tribute to the song or the melodious voice of the nightingale. But that does not happen in the poem. The poet, through unusual metaphors, imagery, symbolism, and the unusual comparisons and devices, defamiliarizes what we know. We know the nightingale as a songbird, that is a bird who is representative of the month of April and March, or the time of spring. But how the poet has considered the bird an immortal being because of the melody and the voice that could even be heard in the heavens. How that idea seems new to the reader. The bird is not new. The nightingale's praise is not a new idea. Many poets may have done so. But the way Keats endows the bird with divinity, with the qualities that make him eternal and divine, that is the notion that can be seen as defamiliarization. It has been made strange. We begin to respect, we begin to revere the ideas present in the poem, because we feel as if we have never imagined that. We have never witnessed this ordinary songbird earlier in this light. So the light in which the writer presents it, the poet Keats presents it, is a defamiliarization of an act that we have been familiar with. So this is how the concept of defamiliarization works. That poets might be talking about the same ideas again and again. They might come up with new themes, which would be difficult to, but they do come up with new, innovative ways of saying the same things. When they find new, novel, and unusual ways of saying and expressing the same things, the reader feels the need to pay attention. And hence, the critics, like the stylisticians or the formalists, find this novelty worth noticing for the sake of analysis of literary works. And they term this notion as defamiliarization, as something that is known to the reader is made to appear strange and unusual, as if we have encountered it for the first time. The formalists also stress the importance of form, and they emphasize on the use of techniques, on the use of devices. So their focus is on form and technique rather than content, and they look for specifically the literary devices for the sake of looking at how literary art or the art in poetry is autonomous, independent, and more meaningful than what the literary critics associated it with. So the formalists stress upon the study of language of poetry with reference to their focus on its form, technique, and style, emphasize the fact that there existed a gap in literary studies, because the literary critics were not paying as scrupulous and detailed attention to the form, technique, and style of language. What the literary analysts in the formalist school applied on language, or on the study of language in poetry, as an experimentation or as the development of a style of literary criticism, this approach can be easily and has been later applied to other works of literature as well. Though initially formalists started their practical understanding and analysis of the style of literature from choosing the mode of poetry, because poetry allows a writer more room to present the ideas in a strange, unusual, and unique ways. But what the formalists applied on the language of poetry for the study of the language of poetry can be applied on any other genre or any other form of literature too. Using the principles developed by the formalists and the concepts developed by the formalists, we can not only study poetry and its language and form, but also it can be applied to the study of novel, prose, drama as well. So the focus on form over the content is the main focus of the formalist school. Formalists remained committed and dedicated to the idea that literariness alone, rather than the referent, can determine the meaning, or the literary scholarship also, like literary scholarship in the form of literary critics, linguists, or the experts who want to comment on the meaning and value of the text for the sake of understanding its meaning and judging its position in the literary canon. They must focus that anything that possesses literariness is to be termed as literature, rather than looking at the referents of the work. Referents, the social influences on the writer's life and work, time and society, political influences, or psychological and personal bent of mind that would have led to the creation of a work. This should not be the focus of a critic. And that is the standpoint of the Russian formalists. Formalists believe that only literariness and the study of language of literature must be the focus of criticism. No other references and influences on the work, either on the society in which the writer lived or on due to the circumstances that the writer had been through personally, should be associated with the meaning of the work. So they want to study the meaning and language of a text independently of the author and the society in which it is produced. So the literariness and language, which becomes the focus of the formalist, is designating the shift from the personal perspective to the objective and scientific approach of the text. In the USA, the same approach, known as formalism, had been developed as new criticism. Now, what is called Russian formalism is also called the new criticism, because the ideas that are developed by the Russian formalists in Russia, by their emphasis on the study of the poetic language, on the idea of literariness of a language, on the idea of defamiliarization as an act that a writer does in writing. The critics in Russia, the critics in USA were influenced by the same idea, and the ideals presented by Russian formalists were followed in America by the critics who formed a new school referred to as new criticism. So the same theories that are proposed by Shklovsky and Jacobson for Russian formalism were advocated and advanced in America under the banner of new criticism, that emphasized that literary texts are discrete entities, discrete, unique, and independent, autonomous. And their meaning and interpretation need not be contaminated or influenced by the intentions and leanings of the author, either ideological, historical, social, or psychological. So if the literary critics try to find out the writer, his personality, his time, his influences in the work, the formalists and in America, the new critics, they want to study literary work independently. They want a separate study of literature, which should not be governed that the meaning of a text be determined by social, ideological, political leanings of the writer. Now, the focus is on literariness and defamiliarization. It means what the text and the language of the text itself contains. And if the form and content of the text becomes the focus, all other influences, either of the society or of the personality of the author, go to the background. They recede into the background. Now, that is the unusual, unique thing for the time, because in the 20th century, early or beginning of the 20th century, this was a new discovery. This was a new principle that was initiated for the study of literary writings. So this was known as a kind of breakthrough, or a kind of novel idea in criticism, because earlier the writers never separated or dislocated a text from its place of origin or from its creator, the author. Now that the formalists and the new critics have emphasized the importance of literary language, literariness, and defamiliarization, they are presenting the idea that text is independent and layers of meaning and depth of understanding can be gained by only focusing on the literary aspects of the language itself, regardless of the author's personality or the social circumstances in which the text was produced. So the historical and social influences must not be taken into account for the formalists, for the new critics, for the study of a literary text. The Russian formalists studies various functions of the concept of literariness. Now that we have looked at that, what is the concept of literariness? Literariness is the extraordinariness of literary language. That ordinary language of speech and writing may not contain use of metaphors, symbols, personification, imagery, and such devices which make it sound literal. That is mostly done in the poetry or in the literary language. So when literariness is one of the distinctive features of literary writings and poetry, the purpose of the critics and the formalist critics should be to study its purpose, its use, its significance, and its formation for the sake of conveying a meaning in a literary writing or a poem, for example. So the formalists maintained that it is the literariness that distinguishes poetic language or literary language from rest of the expressions, from the ordinary language too. So when we use the term poetic language, we seem to say the same, that it is a literary language, not just concerned with poetry, but even we see that in stories, prose, as well as in novels and plays as well, the writers make use of poetic language. Observe, for example, the plays of Shakespeare or Marlowe. Both the Elizabethan dramatists, Marlowe and Shakespeare, make use of poetic language in their dramas. Now, it does not mean that poetic language would be just the language of poetry. Poetic language generally refers to the language of literature. Formalism was important in the Soviet Union until 1929. So the first 2 decades of the 20th century was the time when Russian formalism dominated and influenced the literary theorists, the literary critics, and the linguists, and later on the scholarship that developed in Europe, in England, and in America in the form of new criticism was what became the focus of the studies and pursuit of further literary criticism and schools. So formalism, if associated with the place of its origin, Russia, lived only for 20 years, but it did not die in the sense that it had its impact upon the theories which are to come. The later on theorists, like another school in the form of new criticism, emerged in America that was to pursue and further develop the notions initiated by the formalists. The formalist school lost its significance after the 20 years, from the beginning of the 20th century till the end of the 1929 and 30. But it does not mean it brought an end to the movement and its ideas. These ideals were adopted by new critics, later on by structuralists, and later on by post-structuralists, or the school of deconstruction, or even the discourse analysts and the critical discourse analysts. So we see that Russian formalism was playing a pivotal role in the development of the concept of the importance of linguistics and the study of language of literary writings. Now, from here onwards, the critics, linguists would begin to become more concerned with the understanding and analysis of meanings of literary texts, not just the language used in the society in the form of spoken discourse only. So, one thing that it was attacked by was that Russian formalism lacked a political perspective. Because of this reason, that during the development of the Russian formalism in 1920s, another movement that was in focus was of Marxism. Marxism that developed out of the theories of Karl Marx, who emphasized the notion of importance of political ideology in a text, that how text represent ideas, perspectives of either political nature or the nature in which you are influencing the readers. Now that we say that a writer's personality and the social context is ignored in Russian formalism. It means that a political perspective cannot be associated with text. Text cannot be seen to be presenting an ideology, which the Marxists believe in. So the major criticism that the formalist school received was from the Marxists. They attacked Russian formalism to be inadequate and inappropriate because the Russian formalists have separated literary meaning and understanding from society, whereas Marxists believed that society influences the language of literature and text to convey ideologies, to convey view. So that is the point of contention between formalism that focuses on language and disregards social influences on the author's mind, and they must not, according to them, be located in the text. They must not be associated with the text. Whereas the Marxists did not approve of the formalist movement or their criticism, regarding it to be something which would not take into account the political ideology or the advocacy of the stance and ideology on part of the author, because Marxists believed that the author presents a stance, perspective of a political party or a group, or has an ideology to represent through his text to the reader, which would explicitly or implicitly influence the reader. So this is the reason that in Russia, in the 1920s onwards, the Russian formalism did not gain its popularity or could not maintain its same appeal for the public, because there the Marxists did not like the formalist approach of literary writings. So later, largely through the work of structuralist linguist Roman Jacobson, it became influential in the West, notably in Anglo-American New Criticism, which is sometimes called formalism. So that is telling you the connection, that if Russian formalism died after the 1930 in Russia, but the major role that it played was that it ignited, or it gave a spark to a feeling or a thought that literary text could be studied independently because of the focus on language. We must not locate the author in the text. We must not locate the time, history, and politics in the text. We should focus on the independent use, literariness, defamiliarization of the text. Now, this idea of significance and the focus on text was adopted by Roman Jacobson, who emerged as a major structuralist. Structuralism is another school that developed in literary criticism and linguistic studies later on after formalism. So formalism is the first such movement that brought us into the realm where the literary criticism could be expanded. From the time of Aristotle till the time of T.S. Eliot in the 19th century or 20th century. The approach for the study of literature was only a literary critics approach. When the development in linguistics began in the 20th century, it led to the emergence of the school called formalism, and formalism is what gave way to the development of the field of stylistics. That is to start a developed, well-formed understanding or approach of the analysis of literature. So that is the purpose of studying the importance of formalism in stylistics. That if stylistics is a discipline or a technique for the analysis of literary works, just like literary criticism had been, then what is it that is different in this approach that distinguishes it from the traditional approaches of literary criticism followed by Aristotle and even the time till Eliot? Now that the approaches in the 20th century, the beginning of the formalism, then the development of formalism into new criticism, and then new criticism giving way to structuralism and post-structuralism, or later on into deconstruction. This tells us of the significance of formalism, not only for stylistics, but also for the scholarship of literary criticism and literary understanding of texts in general. So as a field of study, stylistics is born out of the movement of formalism that began in Russia. And then if the Russian formalism lost its vigor after 20 years, its concepts did remain alive in one form or the other with certain other movements like new criticism in America and also structuralism and post-structuralism, which were the developments due to the improvement of literary scholarship and understanding in the perspective which a linguist adopts for the study of literary texts. Formalism views literature primarily as a specialized mode of language, and it proposes a fundamental opposition between literary or poetic use of language and the ordinary and practical use of language. This is one of the major or initial or starting points of formalist analysis, that they agree on this point and they do not compromise on this point, that language of literature and the language of the ordinary expression be merged. He says, the Russian formalist says that literary language is distinctive and unique. It operates and is governed by certain rules which are not there or which are not found there in the ordinary expression of language. So that is why they distinguish between the ordinary or practical language and the poetic or the literary language. To the formalists, the central function of ordinary language is to communicate the message to the listener or the reader, whereas the language of literature does not take communicating a message or idea as its primary focus, because the focus of an artist is on aesthetic satisfaction of his own being as well as the aesthetic satisfaction of the reader. Now that the impulse is artistic, which is not generated by the impulse of conveying an idea, then it signifies that the language or expression employed for the sake of an aesthetic or artistic expression would be extraordinary, unusual, unfamiliar, and strange. So this is how literariness is added to the literary language, because the writer is not influenced by the urge to convey a message, but to convey a message artistically. So here the primary focus becomes the language and the form of a text, and the message or idea goes to the background. It becomes secondary. Whereas in the ordinary expression or the everyday speech and writing, the primary focus is to communicate, and the secondary purpose would have been to impress or to influence the listener or the reader. So If the language of literature takes its primary purpose as the artistic purpose, then the writers deliberately and with pain and effort create a style. For example, they defamiliarize, they present a notion with the help of maybe a metaphor, a symbol, which we might not have looked at in that perspective in which the writers looks at. So, the purpose of literary language is to give aesthetic satisfaction to the writer and the reader, and to fulfill the artistic purpose of creation. Let us look at the major approaches which are used by the formalists for the study of the literary writing or the poetic writing. First one is that the focus of the formalists, the angle of the formalist is that he looks at language as autonomous or independent. They emphasize on the autonomous or independent nature of language. It means that the study of literature is neither a reflection of the author's life, his psychological, political, and philosophical, religious leanings, but it is independent and autonomous. It is not the byproduct of history, time, or era, or region. So a text must be separated from these influences: author's biography, author's psychology, his religious beliefs, his political beliefs, and even the history and time in which the author lived. Then, only focusing on style, a formalist would look at the language independently from the context. Another important notion that the formalists pursue their understanding of the text from is that they define the formal properties of poetic language. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that poetic language is not just language used in poetry, but it is a term used in general to refer to the language of literature. So, formal properties of literary language or poetic language in prose, fiction, in drama, novel, and also in poetry. Formal properties would be, for example, use of devices, imagery, and structure, syntax that governs creation of poetry and marks it as different from the ordinary expression. So, these properties or features of form. Now, recall the earlier lecture in which our study was focusing on the features of linguistics, like study of phonological patterns, semantic patterns, rhyme and rhythm, and syntactical patterns. We looked at each of the 7-8 components that form the language of a text. Now, these are the formal properties. Now, those formal properties in the form of rhyme, meter, rhythm, and also syntactical pattern, graphology of a text, these formal properties are the focus of formalist study. So, he would look at literature as discourse representing properties that govern its creation and make it different from the creation of the expression of the ordinary speech or writing. Another important feature that the formalists focus on is the special function of literary language, that is to reinvigorate language and to redeem it from the insipid, vapid state in which it has sunk due to the everyday use. Now, this point is very important because the formalists start from this angle that the purpose of a literary artist or a writer or a poet is to reinvigorate language. A writer wants to add life to the dull and ordinary or simple language by the use of devices, images which are unusual, strange, unfamiliar, as well as appealing. So, in this way, a writer is adding life to language, a language which in everyday use has lost its vigor. For example, we often come across these notions that the elderly people tell us that the Urdu language that they used to speak in school or their teachers used to speak, or the language which was found in the stories too, was very stately, very dignified. Now the new generation uses the language in a different way. They have modified it, making it sound something in between English and Urdu both. Now, isn't it the everyday use of the Urdu language, for example, that has deprived the language of its grandeur, its dignity, its status, its novelty, which was part of it in maybe 30 years ago, or in the times of our parents when they were studying in school or when they were studying poetry. They comment upon even the poetry as well, that poetry of the poets of their times was more dignified in language as compared to the poets who are writing now. So keeping in view these notions from everyday notion, that how language under the burden of everyday use loses its vitality, uses its beauty, its strength, its grandeur. So the formalists also believe that the language of literary writings is invigorating, reinvigorating, or refreshing that language which under the everyday use of due to the purpose of communication and expression has been simplified, has lost its novelty, its beauty, its strangeness, its unusualness. So the insipid and vapid use of language, where language has been turned into a dull, boring, or simple form, and they want to reinstill into poetic language or literary language the flavor and the vigor which is the part of literary expression, and dignity and charm is to be lent to the literary language if it has to contain the messages, the meanings which the writers have encompassed within the use of images, metaphors, or even symbols. So the writers do a job of maintaining the vigor, the strength, and the beauty of the language by the use of stylistic or figurative devices. Otherwise, our language would have become quite ordinary, mundane, or even boring too. It would not remain as appealing as it had been had there not been the contribution of literary artists, writers who are reinvigorating language, who are refreshing language. So this sensation prevails in the expression of literary writings, in the expression of the literary artists who express that a work of art or work of literature should appear different and unusual because of the unusual, extraordinary language. Another important feature that the formalists focus on, apart from autonomy of language, formal properties of language, and reinvigoration of the language, that is defamiliarization. We have touched it a little earlier in our discussion as well, that defamiliarization is making something familiar sound strange. And we looked at it with the example of Ode on a Nightingale, that how the poet as an artist, as a literary artist, defamiliarizes the object that is the nightingale and makes it appear new, strange, unusual to the reader by associating with it with those qualities which we might not have imagined. So the formalists study the way in which certain aesthetically motivated devices, for example defamiliarization, determines the literariness or the artfulness of a work. So it is due to defamiliarization, it is due to the concept of adding strangeness and beauty to the text that a text becomes an artistic expression. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been an artistic composition or a literary composition. So if a poet or a writer can defamiliarize, that is how we judge his merit or his literary merit, because he has the ability to attract the audience, surprise the audience, lead the audience into his work. So if he defamiliarizes, or if he makes ideas appear strange and unusual as if a reader is encountering it for the first time, then he would be able to attract the audience or grab their attention. So this is how a literary work gains its merit, through defamiliarization. Then the concept of literariness, that it is the formal language, formal properties of the literary language that make it distinct and unusual. In formalism, the concept of literariness denotes a particular essential function that the language of literature performs, and this is the relationship of the language and the poetry. That poetry is compact, it is unfamiliar, strange, and the ideas it presents are unusual, attractive, due to the language in which it has been composed. For example, changing the syntax of a poem. The way we looked at that example of Frost's poem, that something there is that doesn't love a wall. Now, had the line been, there is something that doesn't love a wall, it wouldn't have appeared artistic, poetic, literary, or a notion of defamiliarization wouldn't have occurred there. By putting the word something in the beginning of the statement, by inverting the syntax, the poet defamiliarizes the notion of the construction of a statement or a sentence. That is how he grabs the attention. That is how he makes this work or a poem sound interesting. So these notions that are propagated by the formalists in the form of autonomy of the text, without its link and relationship with author, time, and society, the formal properties of language like the literary devices, and the reinvigorating language, for example, adding strength and beauty to it through the use of language which is not used in ordinary speech and writing. Then defamiliarization, that present to reader what he knows in words and language that would make him encounter something as if he had never known it before, and he will be surprised to receive it, and there will be a refreshing sensation that he would feel. Then literariness, the most important idea, that literary language is distinguished from the ordinary language, and it is the essential function of poetry that it must determine that the literary language is the language of literature, and no literary language used in literature would not make it sound or seem literary. So that is how they approach the notions. Now, for the sake of the understanding of formalism's importance in stylistics, we have to recall that we are studying formalism to understand what formal features and properties and key elements it introduced to the study of literature, which were initially not focused by the literary critics. So, formalism is enriching the stylistician's analysis. That is why we are paying attention to it. So, we looked at how formalism emerged, how it developed in Russia, and how it led to development in further schools of criticism in the form of new criticism, structuralism, post-structuralism, and later on it would lead to studies in deconstruction as well. Then we looked one by one at various concepts like defamiliarization, literariness, and poetic language, as well as the concepts presented in the form of the reinvigoration of language and difference between poetic language and ordinary language. All these points being emphasized in the discussion have been presented by the formalism, which would become very pivotal and significant for the study of literary criticism and the linguistics as well as stylistics. So this is what stylistics owes and takes from formalism. These concepts add to the improvement and development in the discipline of stylistics, which is to approach the literary text for understanding, interpretation, and to apply the criticism on texts. Thank you very much. We will inshallah meet for the next lecture in which we will continue with the discussion on formalism.